Okay, welcome everyone to the Psychology of Global Crisis Conference. My name is Carolin Demuth. I'm from Aalborg University, and it is my great pleasure to introduce the next keynote speaker to you. Before I do so, a note for the Q&A function to ask questions and collect them for our discussion after the talk. Nandita Chaudhary has for many years been professor at the Department of Human Development and Childhood Studies at Lady Irving College at the University of Delhi, from where she recently retired. She is, however, very active still in the scientific community and frequently invited as keynote speaker at various conferences. She is internationally renowned in the field of cultural psychology, with her research interest being in child socialization practices. Some of her publications are, for instance, Listening to Culture, published by Sage in 2004. She has also co-edited several books together with Jan Malsinas and colleagues. For instance, Psychology as the Science of Human Being and Dynamic Process Methodology in the Social and Developmental Sciences, both published with Springer. She's also maintaining a blog about our relationships with little people. Today, she's going to talk about the sense of a test, trials, and turbulence in the Indian subcontinent. So please, Nandita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carolin. Namaste, everybody. Hello from Mumbai. Good evening, and I look forward to a good session with all of you. And thank you very much to the organizing committee for inviting me. I'm not an expert epidemiologist. I just do some work in child development and child psychology. So you can imagine what a challenge this has been for me. So I want to, at the outset, say that I have received generous support and suggestions from several people, and I want to acknowledge them right away. Jan Valsena, Robert Serpel, Shraddha Kapoor, Meela Tuli, Punya Pillai, Sujata Sriram, Pooja Bhargav, and Reshu have been very helpful in preparing this presentation, and thank you very much to them. So I'm going to try to share my screen right now. So please tell me if that is something that goes through. But when I do that, I lose my Zoom. So I'm going to have to okay. So I hope everybody can see the screen now. The situation so Carolin, when she invited me, she asked me to speak specifically about the Indian situation. I think that people have assumed that there is a lot of mystery about what's going on in India. And I'm going to talk about some of those issues as we go along. But at the outset, I want to say that, the whole issue of Vision 2020 was mentioned in a book by our former president, Abdul Kalam, and also in Lady Irving College. When we planned a seminar, we had taken the metaphor of Vision 2020 for perfection and hoping that by that time, we would have a good hold on the country, the discipline, international relations. But look what happened. And I want here to mention Thomas Friedman's article where he says that, the way we're going to look back is that there was a time BC, which was before Corona, and AC after Corona. So let me get on first to the situation in India as I understand it and as I have collected from my readings. So on January 20th, we had the first case in Kerala, an Indian student returning from Wuhan. No significant evidence in February. We were all traveling around, probably getting seasonal flu. On 4th of March, 14 international tourists developed symptoms. I think this was in Rajasthan. And on 22nd March, the first death happened. And there was a one-day test curfew by the government. On 24th March, harsh country-wide lockdown of Indians happened. On 2nd of April, an app was developed, which now they say has crossed TikTok and Pokemon Go or something, and it has Setu. 6 states have now been declared COVID-free: Goa, Sikkim, Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh. But the sharpest spike happened on 19th May. On 17th May, there were 92,000 odd cases. Today, there are over 100,000. And now over about 3,000 deaths. No known significant spread has happened in rural and tribal areas. So if we look at the samples tested, here is the data, and you can see the percentage tested positive. This is all accessed from government. This particular data is from the ICMR. Here's a look at, you can see how Mumbai and Gujarat are a center of the COVID cases. As we sit precariously in Mumbai now, with our fingers crossed, hoping that somewhere something takes a hold of this crisis. When we look at, I've just taken a selected case of USA, France, Vietnam, China, and India. I'm not saying that these figures are accurate. These are what are in the public domain. And we can just do a quick comparison of what has happened. I will refer to this table again when I talk about media sharing and news. If we look at India has, I think, 17.7% of the world's population. If you compare, if you just look at this graph, it's kind of, the difference is quite stark. So what was the reason for all the fear and uncertainty? I think fear and uncertainty were created because everybody was worried about their own lives, about their loved ones. But we were depending largely on, we still are depending largely on mathematical disease models, which, as medical anthropologist Cardiff has mentioned, are not necessarily always, the assumptions of those models are not always very well known. They're not disclosed. Somewhere the disinvestment in public health in many parts of the world also led to a crisis. Round-the-clock media coverage has been seen as responsible for a lot of our discomfort and uncertainty and fear in the present times. But also, there is an indication that authoritarian leaders really like the idea of destroying something and rebuilding it, and being known as the people who saved their country or the world or whatever. And as Luca mentioned in his presentation, the warlike metaphors proliferate, and these all lead to fear and uncertainty. Let's look back at India's timeline and look at some of the consequences that happened. Random and chaotic consequences of lockdown, stay home. Everyone wanted to return home to safety. I mean, so would I if I was somewhere away from home. But it hit people the hardest who really didn't have homes like we do. So an estimated 139 million workers come from the countryside to India's cities. They were not considered in the serious lockdown. Another thing that happened, which is significant, is that expecting people to work and study from home. I was just talking with my colleague, and she said that many of the students in our college are not comfortable about, this whole online, their access. I mean, we are worried about whether our connection is going to, we've had problems with this conference as well. I mean, students who come from homes where internet connections may not be as stable cannot be expected to be available online as of. Similarly for work. Physical distancing is I don't know why we started calling it social distancing. As Professor Anne Nelly posted on one of her social media platforms, it should be physical distancing and social solidarity. I thought that was a very profound correction. So when there is poor housing, overcrowding, and stay at home, I mean, it's if you have a home, right? Also, significantly in the first couple of weeks, the movement of essential goods was sporadic. And fortunately here, I would say, and I have read several articles, one by my colleague Paromita Vora, where a significant number of private citizens and small organizations stepped in. What about employees of essential services? Suddenly they were without schools or childcare, or, and what about people who needed medical attention? So I think some of the chaos was related to the fact that there were not enough, we hadn't anticipated, the government had failed to anticipate what was going to happen as a result of this lockdown, stay home. Thousands of people walked home for thousands of miles. And I think that some of these images are going to stay in our minds for a long time. And I was saying that it's going to be hard for us to forget this. And then I corrected myself in conversation with some. I don't think we should forget these images, because it was like the Home Alone movie, except they were outside alone. And it wasn't funny. People, the stories that have been emerging have been heartbreaking, to say the least. Another important phenomenon that happened was the prevailing equation between classes was overturned. I overheard a conversation in the early days of the lockdown saying that COVID arrived because of the wealthy, but now we are suffering. Another important phenomenon was the part-time domestic helpers for middle-class families. This was suddenly suspended. A very interesting article by my colleague Shalini Grover. I have the reference at the end for you in case you need it. But this was also mentioned in the keynote address yesterday from Cairo, that this was, a lot of the gender relations have been impacted both within the home and at the workplace because of the sudden unavailability of people to help with. What about quarantine facilities? Inadequate, uncomfortable, at least what I've heard in personal communication. Although recently we heard another story about a rural area where one of the people who was working with us reached back home, and he says he's pretty comfortable because in villages, schools have been, quarantine centers have been created in schools. But there were cases of people wanting to run back home. And there was also a very serious fear of infection during quarantine at the centers. Some of the questions that Shalini Grover raises is, are we finally going to acknowledge, the importance of hired help in our lives? Another thing is gender relations. Will men come to terms with this invisible gendered nature of housework? How is this going to impact the relationship between, the immense support many of us have for our housework? And how will this change in the present scenario? This is just something funny about the consequences. It says that I'm afraid the news isn't good. Word has it that consumers are starting to find out what actually matters. Another important thing I wanted to talk about was the accidental exposure of cultural patterns in a crisis. So the lockdown caused panic. Panic exposed some of the social structures and moral values. This is something that Valsenar had written about recently, and I'm borrowing the idea from him. So cultural patterns really became unmasked in a way, where our weaknesses as societies became unveiled, but strengths, on the other hand, may go unnoticed, like family solidarity for many of the cases, but we can discuss this as we go along. The second thing that I wanted to point out was the emergence of new meaning. Masks have become a universally recognized moral symbol, that you're a responsible person. People can actually turn around and correct you, even become offended if you're not wearing a mask. So what I've seen recently is that a lot of people have taken to merely hanging something around the neck and leaving it there as an acknowledgement of this particular mask as a symbol. In India, if you're familiar with newspaper reportings, you always see suspected criminals covering their faces to prevent recognition. Covering is no longer associated with hiding and secrecy and subterfuge. In fact, if it's not worn, as I said earlier, you can be shamed for it. So what are some of the things that we have in culture that are becoming, they're becoming attended to now? There is the prevalence of ghungat or hijab, or even covering the face of, people when you're working with dust or when there is some unpleasant smell around. Then culturally, there is the notion of jhuta, which is I cannot explain it. I'll need a whole 1 hour to explain the complexities of what jhuta means. But very simply, it is associated with not sharing fluids, sometimes even within the family, while drinking, eating. Largely, the mother-child unit is exempt. I want to say here that I'm not endorsing these practices, because for many of us, we had learned how, to say that, oh, come on, it's okay. But jhuta is a notion that is very significant, and you're not supposed to drink from the same glass, eat from the same plate, and so on. Social distancing, the whole purity pollution based on caste, class, occupation, religion, exposure, is a strong practice. And recently I was having a conversation with somebody in my family who had to be quarantined briefly. And he is a hospital employee, and he was referring to someone a mother who had given birth to a child, and she was discovered subsequently to be COVID positive. And he used the expression sangya. That means usually it's referred to something getting wet. Thanks to Pooja and Reshu for helping me understand this. It polluted, dirty, but it is also used for something solid becoming fluid-like or semi-fluid. So this is the sort of meaning shift that is taking place. People are using familiar terms to describe these new experiences. Sutak is a period I didn't know about, again, thanks to my friends. It's a ritual period of self-isolation after birth, death of a family member, after eclipses, not just for humans, even deities are periodically isolated. So that is something that is not unknown. And again, recently I received an invite for review of a journal article where it started and ended with a namaste. And I was very happy to see. So that's another thing that is significant. So not touching the other person is something that's culturally very familiar. Then there are ritual baths after a trip, funeral, separate clothes for cooking, separate clothes for the kitchen, no footwear in the house, daily cleaning of floors, separation of inside, outside footwear. I've already mentioned that. Washing hands before and after eating. It's almost like the older people are going, don't say we didn't tell you about it. The other thing that has emerged, which I want to attend to, is migration within the country. Usually migration within the country, or actually the word immigrant or migrant workers, as we refer to the large number of people who have walked back and now probably taken the trains and buses back. There is this immigrant expatriate distinction, which is an interesting one because it is the usage of immigrant expatriate is used depending upon where you're moving from and where you're moving to. So if you're moving from a relatively poor country to a wealthier one for better options, for success, you would be called an immigrant. But if it's the reverse, you would be called, the common usages, although I don't think there is any distinct meaning difference, but then you would refer to yourself as an expatriate who is living in another country. Shikhar Gupta, the journalist, asked, why do we refer to them as migrant workers? Because they're just moving back from cities to villages. Did I call my son when he moved to Bangalore? Did I call him a migrant? No. So there is a very specific angle to the use of the word migrant. I think that the associated words that I can come up with is displaced, poor, unfortunate, ignored, unimportant, and probably even exploitable. The meaning, as Peirce would say, has become abducted, or as Jan was mentioning, it becomes obstructed and it moves in a different direction. Although Peirce didn't use it in the same way, he used the term abduction as a scientific discovery where it's not deduction, induction, but abduction, where you suddenly develop a new meaning. So let's go now. Carolin was very eager that I talk a bit about testing in India and what are the ways in which testing is being done. Again, I'm not an expert, but I've tried my best to gather some data about. I want to first, before giving the measures, I want to talk a bit about the limits of measurement. This subtle and nuanced understanding of issues should not be allowed to disappear on the grounds of the needs of an emergency, as Veena Das has said. Big data is very powerful in sending messages, even wrong ones. Numbers are respected and suspected depending upon who is presenting them. I was listening to the recent controversy from the Imperial College of London about the Ferguson effect is not a thing, it's just something that I wrote for myself. And the assumption of all things being equal, I don't think we can have that assumption. Let's just look at the complexity in epidemiology. You have individual level differences, you have group level differences, your immune system, comorbidities, viral load, vaccination history, age, sex. If you look at groups, you have ecology, cultural practices, exposure, health practices, economic status, and so on. So a testing strategy for any country cannot be the same as it is in Sweden or in the UK or in the US. It has to be developed locally. Who you're going to test, how many you're going to test, and what tests you're going to use. So what did India do? Initially, in the months of February and March, there was a testing of SARI cases, which stands for severe and acute respiratory illnesses in hospitals. Limited testing of symptomatic cases only, and intense tracking, cluster containment strategy. If there is a case, currently my neighborhood is under cluster containment strategy, and it's being very strictly followed. We don't have any policing, but the citizens have been amazing, I think, in this. I would like to acknowledge that. But widespread testing is happening in hot zones. Hot zones are those which have a cluster of cases. Isolation and quarantine of infected and contact cases, incidents, recorded fatalities, and tested cases, absolute numbers, I agree, are likely to be underestimations. And I want to thank my friend Sujata for mentioning this to me, that it is likely to be far more error-prone than we imagine. But still, if we look at the percentage of cases tested, it will be a more reliable figure. The numbers may be underrepresented, but another thing about India that we need to acknowledge is media presence and citizen awareness, and the reporting that is happening on social media is intense. I think we need to look a little bit at the issue of equality, ethics, social justice, cultural practices, national and international issues. I'm going to take the example of media coverage briefly. So I'm going to skip this slide and go on to the next one. A Sri Lankan journalist has written recently, her name is Samarajiva. She claims that when the Western media covers the pandemic, her position is that Asia isn't well understood. There is an unequal positioning between countries. There is, as Shekhar Gupta says, dismay and disbelief about the statistics. Why aren't more people dying? India is a poor country. And he says, have we in fact disappointed the world by not having more dead people? When we look at inter-country differences, I think even we are amazed at why aren't we dying? So how do we deal with this? We cannot have an answer to this right now. And I think we will know only here, once all the research is in place and all the collaborations are successful, then we will be able to know why this is happening. I want to take the example of an article from the New York Times. I'm going to share some images with you in the next slide. So this is an article by Atul Locus, sorry. Atul Locus has taken these fantastic photographs of Mumbai about people at the railway station wanting to go back home. About, this is on the right is a picture of masks hanging out to dry by a window. I want to bring your attention to the next photograph. This is a photograph that I too am, when I'm sharing it, I'm also guilty of the same kind of difficult, ethical dilemma that probably I'm hoping Atul Locus also faced. Can you just walk into somebody's house and take pictures like this? I mean, I think there is I would not give permission for people. And even if they did give permission, did they know how this picture would be interpreted by others? So I have issues about this with Western media. I really like this quote from Pico Iyer, who's a travel journalist and greatly, he's accomplished person, writer. What the lockdown teaches us is that we have much less control over the external world than we realize, and much more control over ourselves than we suspect. Some of the other realizations that we have is that I can come up with is that we can live with much less physical distancing separates us from public, but this was an article by an epidemiologist, but it also brings us closer to the people whom we live with. So some research is indicating that the spread between same groups is higher than mixed ages. Family ties are important. People from all over the world were eager to return to whatever home meant for them. A little comment about children and the panic about homeschooling. I think, at least my position is, and I'm willing to debate that, children will learn anyway. They're far more resilient than we believe. I think what they're learning now is they're learning to deal with the fear and uncertainty. I mean, can you imagine? Going to school is such a serious thing. If school is closed, something serious must be going on. Then there is the issue of people being laid off. And also, when people withdraw, nature healed itself so fast. Looking ahead very quickly on how life as we know it is no longer sustainable. I think this is something I said in a keynote address last year as well. But the new situation is that the crisis provides us with an opportunity for course correction, and I think we should take that opportunity. Only productive way forward is to collaborate, whether it is in science or in commerce, trade, politics. Nations can no longer ignore the problems of other countries. You know, usually epidemics were out there far away till AIDS hit, and now even more seriously. A brilliant book by Bhrigupati Singh, Poverty and the Quest for Life, is important here because it came out in 2015, but by studying a small village in Rajasthan, he talked about how we need to reconsider the meaning of quality of life to include ideas beyond popular notions. We need to reconsider same-age institutional arrangements for care and education, for care particularly of the elderly. The human and social sciences need urgently to move beyond singular, universal, context-free models. Here, Sunil Bhatia's work is significant. And also recently I read an article on gentle medicine by Jacob Stejanga, which was very interesting and very insightful about how medicine needs, how we offer medical care to people needs to become more gentle. The reference is in the reference list if you wish. Every community needs to reflect on its blind spots. Low priority to health care almost everywhere. Labor in India, elder care in Europe. I want to also assert at the end, before I wind up, that the family is the most dependable caregiver for those in need of support and care. Let us not forget that. Let us not, in our planning, our policy planning and interventions, disregard the family as the primary carer. I think this is something we have realized now. Reena Das, in a recent heartfelt article, has written that preparedness for crisis management must become a part of basic courses everywhere, at all levels of education. There needs to be a shift in interpersonal dynamics, living alone or in the family, solitude and solidarity. They've come to mean slightly different things. And finally, how we need to be aware of everyone, because injustice everywhere, anywhere, is a threat to justice everywhere. So we will only understand when we look back many years later on how, what happened, what hit us. We need to build a more compassionate world, for sure, a more compassionate science. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. Namaste. Here is a list of references in case you need. Over to Carolin.
Okay, so thank you very much, Nandita, for a very, very interesting talk. I can't see myself right now, but you can see me, right?
I can see you, and I'm going to stop the screen sharing, right? We can come back to that in case somebody needs.
Here we go. Yes. Okay, so to the participants now, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A function that I can then address to Nandita. Feel free to post your questions there or comments if you have. So far, we don't have any questions there. So I can maybe ask one that I have. You mentioned, referring to Jan Ralsina's recent article or publication, panic exposes social architecture and moral values, and weaknesses are exposed. And you said we can take that up in the discussion part. So maybe can you elaborate a bit more on what you meant by that?
So let me take the example of the middle class Indian home and its relationship with domestic helpers. This is something that we take for granted. We don't talk about it very much. We don't acknowledge. One of my colleagues, Shraddha, has done her work on alternate care for her PhD work on alternate care for infants of employed mothers. And I will never forget, one of the questions she had was, how does this helper, the caregiver, au pair, nanny, what impact does she have on the child? Can you explain to me? And she said that she's just a maid. What effect can she have on the child? So I think that there is a serious reflection we need to, it's an introspection we need to do as middle class. This is an example of when something is suddenly taken away briefly in a moment of crisis. It becomes more palpable, it becomes more visible. So little things and big things, it's like institutional care, or I don't even know, elder care in Western countries. I think it has become a serious point of discussion. So when a crisis happens, the things come up which may have been not as noticeable before the crisis as they are after.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here from Luca Tateo. Thanks for the insightful talk. I would like to ask Nandita to elaborate a bit more on the idea of gentle. There can be gentle psychology, for instance. How would it look like?
I think a gentle psychology would be collaborative. It would consider the position of the person about whom you're speaking. And here by gentleness, I don't just mean in international relations. I also mean, even in the West, if you look at how psychology has been built upon structures that imaginary structures. I mean, most of the research that we have, it's now well established, is primarily on a small sample of cases. That means that we haven't taken people along. We've considered them immigrants or whatever. You put them in some kind of box, and those they're not considered. So by gentleness in medicine, Stejenga was talking about the fact that we need to be aware of the person whom you're taking care of. For instance, when a decision is taken, the family is almost used only when a critical decision has to be taken off for urgent care. But otherwise, when you look at the family, it's almost like family is a nuisance to a doctor. They don't like having too much interference by the family. If you look at schools, teachers don't like interference from parents. So I think that it is important for us to understand that the client or they are participants, they're partners. So any science in the way that it is implemented must proceed from a position of collaboration and partnership, Carolin. This is what I believe, and this is how I would visualize a gentle science. Not empire building where ideas become industries and you sell 1 million tests and make sell 1,000 tests and make $1 million on, that's not gentle. That's an imposition. You take a particular test and you apply it to people all around the world and you categorize somebody as being less or more intelligent. I don't think that's gentle. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to have more favorable and collaborative ways of understanding psychology and psychological processes, which take people along. I think parents are very insightful about their own children. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this crisis has shown us who they're taking wherever. Maybe there's domestic abuse, maybe there is difficulty, maybe people are getting depressed, overworked, whatever, but they are taking care of their kids. So I think the family has been under-recognized in recent times for the amount of work. And in this, I include large families, large households, which have a lot of problems. I don't want to romanticize the large household with several generations living together. It's not easy. It places pressure on some people, but still, children are cared for, the elderly are cared for. So I think this is what I would visualize. I'm not sure if I'm sure people could add to that.
Okay, we have another question from Nandita Chaudhary. Many thanks for the very interesting that we need a different understanding of quality of life and care. And you suggested a renewed focus on the family as primary caregiver. But what about all those people whose families are not very caring? Shouldn't a democratic state be able to provide care also for those who are not so lucky to be born into deeply caring families? And what role could psychology play in a democratic provision of care?
I have huge problems with people deciding that a family is not capable of caring for someone. Who makes these decisions? Recently, I am in conversation with a friend of mine who's living in Europe, and she, being a professor in psychology, has been hauled up by the kindergarten for being an uncaring mother. And I know her, and Carolin, you also know her. And I think that's the conclusion that the kindergarten has come to is very unfair. So I think that we must be very careful in concluding that a family is not able to care for children or for the elderly based on standards that have been decided from textbooks. Because if we do that, we're going to lose the one institution that we think is capable of assisting. Again, I would say, look what's happened in this crisis. I am not discounting the fact that the state needs to step in when there is no family. I think a child who does not have a family, or who's born or has been abandoned by the family, has a very difficult life ahead. But we know the problems that have been there in foster care and in children's institutions, including in our own country. So wherever, I remember a thesis done by a student in Lady Irwin, where children on the street had formed family-like collaborations at the railway station. So they had fathers, they had older brothers and sisters whom they would eat with, whom they would work with. So it's the family can be imagined as something really positive. It doesn't always have to be. Or let me correct that by saying that it isn't always what it should be, but we must be very careful in judging families, particularly in the case of immigrant families that move to other parts of the world where cultural practices may be somewhat different. Carolin, I can't see you.
Yes, I wanted to give you the floor. That's why I switched off the
thank you.
camera, so that the people more so should see you when you answer and not me. I'm here to only to ask the questions. I would like to take up on that point and on one, since your main focus or one of your main research interests is on socialization practices and child development. Where do you see concrete implications of this pandemic now for child development? Do you see any implications? You mentioned policies, and now you were talking about family. But do you think, how will that impact the development, the psychological, the emotional development of children?
Again, I think that the position of the parents, if they are there and if they care for the child, must be given more important place. Parent-teacher meetings, parent-teacher associations in Indian fee-paying schools is, parents are tolerated most of the time. But in public schools or government schools, it's even less. So I think that parents must, if again, whether it is in the field of education or healthcare or intervention programs, I think unless the family is taken together, rather than targeting the child and opposing and separating the child from the family when welfare work is done, interventions are done, without that, I'm afraid we will create fractures as we go along, as we have seen in some of the programs that have been working in the country. I think we need to improve healthcare. I need, the fact, if a child is going hungry, we need to sort that out. So again, as to go back to the fact that a crisis exposes our blind spots. I think this crisis has really exposed how importantly we need to work towards, we have enough food as a country, and still there are people who are going hungry. So, it's overwhelming. The task ahead of us is overwhelming. And I think that we have to first make sure, it's like somebody said in an article, wrote in an article recently, schools can wait. Let's just make sure that everybody is fed. Start again, start afresh, think again. It's a good time to review, and I'm sorry I don't have all the answers, but I think that we need, sometimes I think the questions are even more important than the answers. So things that we have taken for granted in terms of children's socialization, and how, racing from one tuition to another, children are still learning. We've gone crazy. Households have gone crazy ferrying children around. Some of that can slow down. I live in a complex where there are hundreds of children, and I don't hear anyone. Otherwise, they drive you nuts. They can drive you nuts with the amount of noise that they make. They scream, and it looks like somebody is torturing them. But for 3 months, we haven't heard sounds of children. So if we look at the capacity and the resilience that there is, we need to recognize that, rather than teaching children as if they come to school knowing nothing. So some of these things, just madly sending children to school at the age of 1 and 2 when there is someone to take care of children at home, that's another issue that we need to review. And so many, I can go on.
Thank you. There were another question about that people expected more people to die in India, and were surprised, or you said almost disappointed that not more people died. And somebody made a comment that the same was true for Africa. People expected much more people to die. And do you see any parallel there, or do you have any explanation why that is?
There is the expression that that you don't want to jinx something. I know that is not scientific. I know, but I don't have any divine vision here. So I don't know. And I think that I hope someday we will come to know this mystery of why we are not dying. maybe there are some things that we are doing right. Is it the mixed age groups in which we live? Is it the heat? Is it the temperature? Is it the ecology? Is it the BCG vaccination that we still continue to receive? What is it? Is it the malaria medication that we have sometimes taken, which we've shared with the US and leaders in the US? I mean, what is it? I don't know. I just know that it could also be, as my colleague and friend Sujata Shira mentioned, it could also be just we have underestimated in terms of how many people have been infected. So I don't know, Carolin. I hope someday soon we will know, because I have been, overcome by trying to figure out as a detective what on earth is going on. And also thanks to your invitation, I've been doing a lot of reading on this, but I don't think anybody has any answers as yet.
Okay, thank you. We have another question by that is a bit linked to that by Gordana Jovanovic. What other countries could learn from India's experiences with coping with the pandemic, or more generally? Or what would you see as its valuable contribution to a common shaping a better future? So what can other countries learn from India?
I think one of the important things that you can learn, that other countries can learn from India, is what not to do. And that is not to ignore the people who are the most disadvantaged in your country. Because if you do that, you're going to have an exodus, a crisis, and a shameful outcome where we are sitting, stay at home. What does it mean for the homeless, for example? I think that we can learn both from India's difficulty at this time, but also from its strengths. And I think that the family and family relationships are an important strength in India. It can also be, when the family turns abusive, it can also be, therefore that much more difficult, because there isn't state support. Police is not very helpful, on the contrary. So I think that these are the two things that come to my mind, Carolin. Okay. Generosity, maybe you can learn to do namaste instead of shake hands. That's another thing.
I just need to quickly look at the questions. One question, let me paraphrase something Jeff Sachs said recently, which is that the West consider pandemics as something that happens elsewhere.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Rwanda and Papa specialist also said that the pandemic is... Okay.
Sorry, Carolin, I couldn't.
Okay, no, I'm just reading. I was looking at the questions, but I just see that our host will take care of the question in the Q&A section, so we don't need to treat that in here in the discussion.
Okay.
Let me just scroll through the questions. And please, to the participants, if you have more questions, use the Q&A function to send your questions. Can you comment on cultural factors that impact the spread of COVID-19 and its mortality in any? Well, you already touched that. We don't need to discuss that anymore here. Yeah. An increasing cases of cybercrime, especially involving adolescents. I don't know, is that a topic also in any context, or is there anything?
Yes, there has been some recent incidents of young boys, and that needs to be tackled, of course. But I think that when there is technological advancement, the misuse is also advanced. So that is, we need to have policy and practice in place to make sure that no children are abused. As a matter of fact, I think there was a suicide also as a consequence. So that is something we really need to take seriously. People should be doing their job in protecting children. And one of the opinion pieces that I read recently was that, again, it was about the fact that, don't believe, for families, there is a tendency to believe, oh, my child is innocent, and therefore this is not something that he would have done or she would have done. I think parents need to be more aware of the fact that children, when they're growing up, they're capable of doing things that you cannot even imagine. So that was one of the things that came out of this article that I read this morning.
Okay, thank you. I'm scrolling through the questions again. We answered that one. One question is directed as in the inequalities and hierarchy. What do you think, does the COVID-19 pandemic have an impact on this increasing gap between the poor and the rich people, and how can that look like? Or what, another question that's in a similar vein, ask about the role of higher education. Maybe you can briefly say something about that.
I think the first one, I'll take the first one first. I think this is an important moment, and I think that there is going to be some rupture in the regular relations between people, because again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people from middle and lower middle classes and they believe that this is an illness that came from the wealthy and has impacted the poor, as I was telling you earlier. So I think we're going to see a lot of change. A lot of people have gone back home, and I'm not sure they're coming back. So I think that we are positioned at a time where it's likely that social relationships are going to change. How they're going to change and how we're going to deal with that, I'm not confident in responding to that, but I know that we are headed for significant social change related to social hierarchy. Regarding the role of education, I mean, undoubtedly, I think that there is no denying. I mean, I just think that we need to discuss these issues. I think ethics and social justice should be a part of every course in higher education, whether you're studying geography and I think that it is in place in the basic curriculum of Delhi University, at least. I'm not sure how well it's being transacted and whether private universities have also followed the same curriculum, but I think that that's a very important fact. Something that Veena Das has written very beautifully about how to go back. What am I going to say to my students in the coming term? I recommend everyone to read that article. The link is there. Back to you, Carolin.
Okay. There's one question, awesome presentation, I agree. As a country, we have always been okay with the lack of medical facilities for the poor, unless now, when people who can afford are pitched again the same facilities for poor, will it change us and make us invest in public health? I mean, you addressed that in a way already. Just looking.
Yeah, I think that if we are going to, one of the things that my husband always believes is that if you make sure that people who are in high places, administrators, government servants, if they all use the public system, it'll improve. But unfortunately, what happens the minute you advance in your career or in your, higher places, you believe that your kid is entitled to private education. So I think there are so many problems we have as a country, and several strengths as well. And one can only hope that as we look ahead, higher education continues to provide the kind of social support that it has always done. But it should be the kind of higher education that does not separate people from their heritage, their culture. I don't mean heritage in the sense of, in the usual sense. And pride, not in the rabid nationalism kind of sense, but a pride in being who you are and being where you are. I think that's an important message. We fail to do that in some of our institutions and higher education.
Okay. Thank you. I have another question myself. You had this quote: "We have much less control over the external world, but more control over the internal world than we suspect." So that is, we could consider that actually as a very positive outcome of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was wondering whether you would like to elaborate a bit more on that, like the psychological consequences of what as an outcome, as a result of the pandemic.
Actually, this resonates very well with the local belief system. I think in India, we don't believe that we have very much control over the external world, because we don't, I mean, you just need to go onto the roads in India when life is normal, and you know that you don't have control over anything. You don't even have control over the weather. I mean, look at what's happened in the eastern coast of India recently. So as a tropical country, and as with the social history and cultural practices, India is in a place where it's hard to imagine that we have external control. It's more something that has emerged from Western civilization, that being human means being able to control your situation. But that's not necessarily true that's not necessarily a shared view in India. So I think it's very profound, and it's an important lesson, and I think it is an important value even in India, that you have control over yourself. My brother is sending me messages saying, "Thank you, Kuldeep." Back to you, Carolin.
Okay. We don't have so many more questions anymore. One question is addressed at the topic of domestic abuse, and whether there is a way of raising insurances of domestic abuse. Do you think that, can you say a bit about what is that a topic, or what your thoughts are about that?
Well, one of the things that has happened in certain parts of the country where women leaders have taken action, and they have closed down liquor stores, and entire villages and entire regions have become dry or alcohol free, and that has significantly managed to control domestic abuse. I'm not saying that that is the answer, but this is something that is an important concern. I am not sure about the incidents. Again, I would go back to my colleague Sujata Shriram, who works in this field and has repeatedly said that this is something we need to attend to. Physical, emotional abuse of women, and yes, we need legislations in place. But this very pretty nice joint family household, as I said, also places a pressure on specific groups, and I think we need to make sure that we have safety measures in place, but domestic abuse is seen as a universal problem, and unfortunate, very unfortunate problem. And abuse of physical punishment and abuse of children, and these are things, abuse of the elderly, these are issues that we need to address seriously in the way forward. And as we are, as we are pressing the reset button on our social lives, I think we need to look at all these issues very carefully, Carolin.
Okay, thank you. There's one question. Do you think religious resilience and the lack of external locus of control work well for us Indians, especially in crisis?
I'm not very happy about the category of external locus of control versus internal locus of control, because I think that the most functional, and I want to acknowledge my guru here, S. Anand Lakshmi, who always said that, it's not one or the other. In certain situations, you're high on internal. And so if you see it as a continuum or as two separate skills that you have, which you can modulate as some situations would require to have a more external locus of control and some in internal locus of control. So treating them as mutually exclusive categories is not productive. It's not an accurate way of representing human capacities. So religion, I am not going to speak about that because I'm not a practicing, I don't follow any religious practice. So, I think it's a private matter, and whether that is something that, if it helps you, I really enjoy, reading religious texts from every religion. As we grew up with gods from different religions in our home. So, I think that for those who it works, I'm not going to judge you, but I also enjoy reading Christopher Hitchens, so you know which side I'm sort of moving towards.
Oops, okay, thank you. There are no new questions at the moment.
So we can wind it up, Carolin?
Yes, I think we can slowly wind it up. If there's any final words you want to say, or otherwise. I
just wanted to say thank you to you for giving me this opportunity. I really enjoyed putting this together. I must acknowledge that I was going a little bit into a small black hole, with with what happened and, things just gradually shutting down. Somehow your invitation pulled me out and I was forced to work. So my house isn't as clean as it was, a couple of weeks ago, because I've been ignoring some of the regular things I was spending time with. But definitely, my last words would be thank you very much to you for inviting me, and to the organizing committee, and also to all my friends and colleagues who helped me put this large, piece together. I've read a lot in the last few weeks, and thank you very much and to Pooja for letting me use her picture. That's all I have to say.
Okay, so thank you very, very much again, Nandita, for a very excellent, very interesting talk and discussion. So thank you very much, and there will be a possibility for those who still have questions and want to ask them later on to use the Slack function. So thank you very much again, Nandita.
Thank you, Carolin. Bye-bye.